Okay, so let's pick up with part two of the American Revolution. So we're already at battle when we started that in part one of our notes. So now in part two, France joins the side of the colonists. France is still mad at Great Britain for the French and Indian War, which was fought between France and Great Britain. So France joins the side of the colonists. And it helps that Great Britain is also fighting other battles elsewhere. They really have too many irons in the fire, and they just don't concentrate on this one back home. They thought it would be small. And anyway, they ended up losing the Revolutionary War, obviously, because that's how we live in America today. The final military victory of the Revolutionary War, official military victory, was at the battle at Yorktown in 1791. And I say the official battle because there's an Arkansas battle actually that came after that at Arkansas Post that is said to kind of sort of almost be related to the American Revolution. Word didn't travel very quickly back then, so we're going to call Yorktown the last official military battle of the American Revolution. And you have to take Arkansas history if you want to find out the other story about Arkansas Post. Okay, so what do? You've won the war, and now you've got to start with nothing. You had an economy that was very British, traditions that were very British. Everything was very British. So the leaders know that the country needs something in order to develop properly. The First Continental Congress focused more on states. They need something that focuses on a central authority. We have Robert Morris, who is appointed superintendent of finance to reorganize the debt from the war and to organize public credit. They start the Bank of North America, which was the first commercial bank in the country. So there's a lot of infrastructure that's got to be built here. If you haven't heard that word before, it's involved in every city, every county, every community. Infrastructure. Sometimes we're talking about things like roads or bridges. We're also talking about specifically here finances. You know, you have to have a financial situation or financial setting in which your country can be very active or involved. We have banks in our cities and towns for that reason today. You got to have finances available. Also, let's see, today we would include like communication lines and that sort of thing that weren't necessarily part of it back then, but infrastructure, basically those basics that you have to have established in order for a community to be solid. So the Articles of Confederation are developed. This is the idea that the Articles of Confederation basically are a stepping stone to the US Constitution. It gives Congress broad powers, but not the ability to tax. It could ask states to contribute taxes or donations based on population. But the problem with that is that each state got one vote in Congress. So some teeny tiny states have the same voice in government as some really big states. The big states didn't think that was a good idea. So there's already some problem. You know, one vote, one state doesn't really fly with the big states. So the big states pay more than the small states, so they feel like they need a bigger voice in government. Also, the Articles of Confederation only had a legislative branch. The states under the Articles of Confederation could still make their own deals with foreign governments. The states could declare war themselves. So it might be, in theory, you could have Rhode Island declaring war against France. Not that they'd want to, but under the Articles of Confederation, that could have happened. They could make treaties, they could mint their own money, and any change to this had to be unanimous. So you have 13 colonies that are now 13 states. And if you want to change anything about the Articles of Confederation, all 13 have to be 100% on board. I don't know if you keep up with the legislative news today or not, but I haven't seen anything unanimous come through in a long time. So there's that. So the Articles of Confederation are a problem. The American Revolution actually inspires other revolutions like the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. So that's kind of interesting. In those two cases, though, they violently overthrew their government and wanted a chance to speak for the poor and the powerless, and they took the oppressor's property and distributed it among the people. So it's a little different in terms of the French and the Russian revolutions based on, what they did with those two things, because we didn't do that here. We didn't do that in the American colonies. We didn't necessarily speak for the poor and powerless. That's a whole different story. We also didn't take property and divide it up. So a little different, but the American Revolution definitely inspired other revolutions. So the Constitutional Convention started May 14th, 1787. It was held in Philadelphia, and the idea was that they needed to find some improvements to the Articles of Confederation. Again, the legislature created by the Articles of Confederation could only ask states to donate money. They couldn't require it. So it's hard to build a unifying federal umbrella over states if each state has the same amount of control and doesn't have to give you money and can do their own treaties and all that stuff. So George Washington is elected to preside over the convention. And James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution because he came prepared with a lot of notes. So he pretty much had it put together. And he also worked very hard to ratify it. So James Madison is the father of the Constitution. One of the good things about the Articles of Confederation, which I've been talking really bad about here in the last few minutes, is that it did actually develop a process for how a territory could become a state. So that was a good thing. And it forbids slavery and westward expansion. Now that's going to be overturned later, but initially it was part of the Articles of Confederation. Alexander Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention wants a complete redo. Hamilton and Madison want to start fresh. So there are other people who just think maybe we could find a little improvement here or there to the Articles of Confederation. Regardless, this meeting was a secret meeting, so they could all speak freely. But James Madison, I love James Madison. He's a man after my own FOIA heart. Okay, FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. So Madison wrote down all the details of the meeting because he was so afraid they were doing something wrong by meeting secretly. Those notes stayed in his personal collection forever, and no one knew about them until after he died. So the notes from the Constitutional Convention were not published until Madison's death. So there were a lot of important considerations that were talked about. One was, how about we create some sort of separation of power between state and federal government? And we need to find some way to fund our country. So let's look at taxation and how can we make that fair? How can we create a situation so that people do have a voice in government that represents their state? How can we regulate commerce and trade? And what are we going to do about slavery? How are we going to continue to regulate that? How are we going to handle foreign affairs? Are we going to allow the states to continue doing that? Or should we do something all-encompassing, like at a federal level? And they also knew that they needed to develop a presidential election process. One of the things that the founding fathers the people at this constitutional convention did have knowledge of is how the Greek city-states developed democracy back in ancient Greece. So the city-states developed the polis. If you remember your time in civilization class or world history, the polis was developed based on local tradition, local language, local community, basically. So there were lots of Greek city-states that had their own sovereignty. And when the Macedonians came to fight, well, this little city-state over here wanted to fight for its people, and this little city-state over here wanted to fight for its people, but they didn't merge together to fight collectively. So ancient Greece missed out on having some sort of overarching guide. So instead of, there was no federal government. So that's something too that these founding fathers are looking at. United we stand, divided we fall. So if we're all these little bitty states, could something happen so that maybe one state would be attacked, and if the others didn't support it, then they might lose their territory too. All of these things are being discussed at the Constitutional Convention. There were 3 plans of organization that were represented at the Constitutional Convention. We'll look at these individually. First of all, the Virginia Plan was presented by Edmund Randolph, who was the Virginia governor. He promoted a bicameral legislature. Bicameral, bi means 2, cameral means house. So he's looking at a 2-house legislature and proportional representation in that legislature. He wants a strong national government with veto power over state laws. So the Virginia Plan very much protects the interest of large states. The New Jersey Plan protects the interest of small states. He wants a unicameral legislature. Again, cameral means house. Uni is the prefix for 1. So 1 house legislature, and he wants equal votes for each state, which is really kind of what they've got under the Articles of Confederation anyway. He wants the president to be elected by the national legislature, and a national governor or the national government had power to raise revenue, regulate commerce, and conduct foreign affairs. So we have little bits of that and little bits of the Virginia Plan that actually are going to come into play. But again, with the unicameral legislature, 1 vote for each state, this is pretty much the same thing as the Articles of Confederation, which has already proven itself to not be strong enough to protect everyone together collectively. Then we have Pinckney's plan. Now, this plan was never really considered on its own. It was similar to the Virginia Plan with its proposal for proportional representation and bicameral legislation, but it's important because it mentions the Supreme Court. So now we have the introduction of another government entity that can kind of help regulate the distribution of power. It also used the terms president, House, Senate, and even State of the Union address. And it gave powers to Congress and methods for legislative impeachment that the other plans didn't include. The compromises between those 3 plans. So there's the Connecticut Compromise, which is also known as the Great Compromise, that develops the bicameral legislature that we know today. The House of Representatives is population-based, and the Senate has an equal number of representatives per state. Each state today has two senators, and then the House is based on population. But there becomes another question. What do you do about the slaves? How do you count the slaves? So when people say that slavery was ingrained in our Constitution, I think this is what it comes down to. I think it comes down to the 3/5 compromise, where slaves, it's determined, will not count as a whole person. So one slave counted as 3/5 of a person. And Native Americans also were not taxed in here. Yeah, 3/5 of a person. So we'll just let that kind of sink in for a minute. It was it's hard to know where to go from that, but yeah, 3/5 of a person for slave count. The reason that they wanted to count slaves, I mean, obviously they could have just not counted slaves at all and really ingrained the idea that slaves weren't people, right? But it was important to the smaller states who were already growing in agriculture, who had large slave populations, that they get to count that population so they'd have a bigger representative or representation in the House. So that's where it came from. And this is really where we start having that first debate about slavery. So in order to ratify this Constitution, they needed 9 out of 13 states for approval. Each state held a ratification convention that was open to the public. So it took a while. It took a while to get this ratified because they wanted everyone to have a say and have some discussion in it. It was done behind closed doors, but in terms of getting the ratification of it, that was all very public. People had a chance to ask questions and to make comments. And this is kind of where we come up with our Bill of Rights too. So the public opinion of this is divided between Federalist and anti-Federalist. Federalists are the people who support the idea of a strong national government, something that the Greeks that we mentioned just recently didn't have. Then we have the anti-Federalist. These people are very concerned about giving control to anyone because they've just come out of a monarchy. So the idea that someone could have control over their state was a little bit fearful. So in order to get this passed, the Federalist promised a Bill of Rights. And this Bill of Rights would guarantee the freedoms and rights of people in the country. There were 12 of them initially, but 10 of them passed, and those are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And Amendment 1 very much focuses on freedom of speech, expression, religion, and all of those things that we generally associate with not just the founding fathers, but the colonists in general. So that's how we go from being very British to having our own country all of a sudden. I say all of a sudden. I wasn't there fighting it, so it seems pretty quick to me. But anyway, that's where we started, and that's where we ended. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me about them.